A lot of this season's guests didn't have any funny money backing them. Very few, right? So they had to make really hard calls, and they're constantly questioning themselves on what are they in it for. And so they might have had those decision points earlier. For me, as I said, as I did Fund One and I saw how challenging it was, I had to make a call on whether I want to make this a lifestyle business and optimize for myself, or start optimizing for everybody I bring into this journey, right? So I'm working as hard for my team members every day as I am for myself.
Hey everyone, we started the second season of the Blume Podcast with a quote from Warren Buffett, where he attributes his success to luck, genetics, and compounding. As we recorded this season, we have had our own share of quotable quotes from our guests. Ramdev Agrawal talked about compounding of India as a nation. Piyush Bansal spoke about compounding customer obsession. Manish Sabharwal spoke about his three key ingredients of company compounding. And Nithin Kamath dwelled on when a startup is actually born. As we wind up this season, we feel it's important to go back to the beginning and wrap our heads around all the themes, factoids, and insights we heard from our guests to leave you, the listener, with the most essential advice on the power of compounding. I'm Rohit Kaul. I lead marketing at Blume Ventures. I've turned the tables today and I have Karthik Reddy, the host of the second season of the podcast, as my guest. For those of you who don't know, Karthik is the co founder and managing partner of Blume Ventures. So, Karthik, you spoke to 9 amazing founders in this season on the power of compounding. I'm curious to know, were there any common threads or shared beliefs among your guests regarding the principle of compounding?
Yeah, so I think I'll first touch the generic ones, and then I'll get into three slices of how the 9 episode series played out. I don't think we had even all the guests lined up when we started the show at the beginning of the season.
Yeah.
And I guess some things naturally just fall into place quite beautifully. And,
Hmm.
it feels like this year was a gift in terms of, everything aligning itself very well. So I'll come to that in a second part. Maybe we can touch upon it in a different question as well. So common threads, I think, were there was obviously this love for customers and customer obsession. All the founders sought out the reciprocity of their passion in customer love,
Mm-hmm.
right? As long as they were fed with customer love, they just found enough fuel to keep going on, right? I
Yeah.
don't think anyone here was obsessed about any other target, valuations, investor goals, etc.
Yeah.
And if you see, there's a healthy mix of companies which lived without investors or fresh investor capital for very long stretches of time in their journey. The second was, I think, custodians versus owners.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you're building a compounding journey, which can last decades, and we have ample evidence of it in this season. And for the listeners, I did a short tweet on chart I'd drawn up for myself, but you might have missed it. So let me reiterate.
Right.
Basically, the youngest company on the podcast was 13 years old,
Mm-hmm.
and the oldest founder, the founder of Hats and Agro, has been running the company for 53 years.
Right.
Right. So that was the breadth of compounding journeys that you saw in this season. And basically, when you look at even amongst some of the younger ones like Zerodha, etc., who's also only 13 years
Mm-hmm.
on paper, though he does say that you should add all of our previous effort into it as well. It felt like two journeys combined
Right.
into one. Same thing that Manish said about team leads. All the learnings from that first, small startup journey which got acquired fed into the second journey almost seamlessly.
Right.
And so when you're doing similar businesses, it feels like one long journey. I mean, one M&A here or there, or the incorporation of a company is just a milestone. Where I'm getting to is when you have multi-decade compounding, then I feel like the founders start wearing the garbs of custodians,
Mm-hmm.
not like my Malik.
Mm-hmm.
There is no owner privilege beyond a point. At the least, you're handing over to the next generation. At the least,
Right.
right? So I think that arrogance is not there, which is refreshing to see, which you do find in a lot of the startup world. This was very well explained by Manish and I won't reveal more. You have to go listen to that episode if you want to know what I'm
Hmm.
talking about. In the whole Jagir versus Amanat, analogy, where he talks of the difference between building what you think is yours versus building what you think belongs to multiple stakeholders, right?
Right.
And all of this is interwoven, but for me, these are important lessons for founders, where your personal choices, therefore, as a manifestation of these last 2 points, which are about the same, a third point emerges, which your personal choices are not equal to all stakeholder choices.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, you making decisions for what is right for you is not necessarily right for the company as a whole. And most, again, founders make the mistake of thinking of these as synonymous, and they're not. And when you've taken other stakeholders with you, sometimes customers, a lot of the times the team,
Mm-hmm.
and invariably a lot of the folks we are speaking to on this podcast have touched venture money, either as an employee or as a founder. That means you have your investor interests also to protect. So this orientation that this is mine, you're on the other side, customers are on the third side, the team is on the fourth side. That doesn't make sense to me. As a summary statement to everything I've said, I think essentially all these founders build with no natural end state for a company. That is the mark of a legendary company. That's a mark of a publicly listable company.
Hmm.
If you look at the origins of the DCF NPV formulas, essentially assumes cash flows go ad infinitum.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And so, why doesn't that happen often enough is something we question. But actually, when you look at a lot of these companies, they're on that path. Now, of course, they can get acquired any given day. Of course, they can get displaced by a challenger company. All of that can happen. But I'm talking about the orientation, the common threads or shared beliefs, is what you asked.
That's right.
And I find that these are inherent in all of the guests we spoke.
Wonderful. Thanks, Karthik. I think it's great that you unpack that. I also remember, apart from Manish, Mr. Ramdev Agrawal and Viniti also talking about building multi-generational companies, especially in manufacturing. Viniti spoke about when you start a company, you are expecting it to be multi-generational. You're not expecting it to be, as you're saying, to have a specific end state. You don't start the company with an end state in mind. So fascinating to hear these common threads. At the same time, Karthik, while you've unpacked these three, were there any insights, maybe out of these three, or maybe something new that you heard, maybe in one episode or maybe across episodes, where you felt that, hey, this is going to sound extremely counterintuitive to the people who are going to listen to this? That, people say, okay, I did not think the world works like this. So any thoughts on that?
One, I think we should take a little bit of self-criticism here.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, there's a healthy cynicism around what role investors play in companies. So that was definitely counterintuitive, because you expect there's a sort of self-importance that you accord to yourself, which is obviously
Hmm.
dumbed down, because a lot of them would have built irrespective of what the capital source was. So doubly so as a venture capitalist, thinking that you're important to build path-breaking companies is probably not true. So that's counterintuitive, I would say. Second is, if you remember in the opening session of this podcast, maybe a few months ago when you and me were chatting,
Mm-hmm.
we talked about the difference between the X Unicorn series last year and the Power of Compounding series this year.
Right.
And when I look back, what I said was we focused on journeys which captured the first 10 years. And here we are trying to focus on the journeys beyond the next 10 years.
Right.
Interesting summation of this series compared to last year's series was when you actually now look at the entire set of 17 episodes across 2 seasons,
Mm-hmm.
they feel all interchangeable. I think we picked guests who are actually on that path in Fund 1.
Mm-hmm.
And in Fund 2, they've actually covered that path, and they're worrying about different problems of intergenerational building and 3 decade, 2 decade, 4 decade kind of problems. But actually, the first season guests were equally compelling in their line. It's amazing. I mean, been around again for 14, 15 years, right? So this all seem interchangeable, though I try to draw a wedge between them. So that's counterintuitive. I think what is counterintuitive is these qualities and beliefs that you talked about in the first question are either latent in the founder and the journey, or they're not.
Hmm.
I don't think you can reclassify them 6 years, 8 years, 10 years down the line. I think by the fourth, fifth year, I mean, in my personal journey, for example, Rohit, you didn't know me when I made that call. I think it took about 4 or 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
After 4 or 5 years, you make that call around. You didn't think too hard about all the things that are required for compounding: culture, long-term believers, long-term institutional base, long-term partners, or in the journey,
Right.
long-term customers. But the minute that penny drops, all your orientation starts shifting towards things that you need to do to build long-term. And so for me, that penny drop was like 4 years into the journey.
Mm.
I don't think it can be much later than that. That was the point I was making. And the last thing I think is, promoter thinking of themselves as a shareholder and still can interoperably optimize for their own self as a shareholder, but also for everybody around them.
Mm.
It's counterintuitive, not to me. I think that was my premise for doing this season, but for a lot of the audience, I think it might have appeared counterintuitive, right? Because there's always this me versus them. I've gotten diluted too much.
Mm.
Crazy stories, right? Like Vinithi's father raising money at face value from the public market to get started, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
over 20 years, it neutralizes itself if you actually have a way to fix it, right? And so I think when you think super long, 20, 30 years, and you build continuity maps with that kind of time frame, then these don't bother you that much. And so all of these were counted.
So just to, summarize what you're saying, you just sort of think of, you're saying there are many parts to build a valuable company and build it for a long term. But first 4 or 5 years is when you choose a path. That's the flex you have as a founder. And after that, once you've chosen a path, to sort of continue on that path. Is that what you were saying, Karthik?
No, I'm actually saying at most you have 4 to 5 years. A lot of these founders seem to have had it from almost day one, year two, something as early as that, right? And it might have been because they didn't have a lot of the this season's guests didn't have any funny money backing them. Very few, right? So they had to make really hard calls, and they're constantly questioning themselves on what are they in it for. And so they might have had those decision points earlier. For me, as I said, as I did Fund One and I saw how challenging it was, I had to make a call on whether I want to make this a lifestyle business and optimize for myself, or start optimizing for everybody I bring into this journey, right? So I'm working as hard for my team members every day as I am for myself. That's exactly my point, right? So I'm the custodian of many stakeholders, careers, not lives, but careers for sure. And those flips of switches can't happen in the eighth, ninth year. And if they don't happen in the first 3, 4 years, then you're not that kind of founder, is my take.
And I think what you're also saying is something sort of which takes me back to what Ramdev Agrawal said. I think one of the first few episodes we recorded about you as a founder cannot be in it just for the good times. You have to be in it for good as well as the times when shit is hitting the ceiling.
And also, there were few things that we should touch upon category wise, which we can do as well. We discussed about talking about lessons for founders. We'll come to that. But here's what happened, right? Very curiously,
Hmm.
if you look at the last 4 episodes, suddenly we went from single generational companies to actually multi generational companies very curiously. And when I found those choices, I was actually excited because I wanted to build some diversity in this dialogue that we're having with founders and sharing with all our listeners. What I mean by that is, look at the Arun ice cream journey. He started it 53 years ago, but his son now runs it very, continues to compound. This is a little like the Ambanis, for example, but in a miniature way. And the other part was, Vinithi's dad having founded the story. But basically, the first 15 years it moved, but not to anywhere close to the scale. And she took it over and compounded from there from 60 crores to 2,000 crores. And actually, what's even more interesting is the other two, where they were actually acquisition led. So if you look at both their minds, Mithun and Radhika, they made calls to note that their constraints on how to build big were not going to curb their mission to build the right kind of company.
Right.
So they took it to strategic investors. If you listen to Radhika's podcast closely, she actually put out a sale process to sell a hedge fund.
Hmm.
Fascinating, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
and Mithun did the same. He convinced Lee to give up his stake so that Titan can take a majority share,
Amazing. Okay.
and then pushed the boundaries of what's possible within the acquired base, which means, me being the founder and all of those are like, those are all small stakes compared to what you can leave behind as a legacy. And Radhika is charged enough to build the public company on her own now with a new entity, and Mithun would have loved to, but like, as he says quite openly, he found a partner who's more determined to own the entire business, so he's walking away from it. But those choices, I'm saying, were made in those first 3 4 years. Those are interesting examples which may not have surfaced as much in the first half of the season.
That's a fascinating observation, Karthik. Shifting gears slightly over here, and you spoke about being you, for example, being the custodian, not just for yourself, but for the larger team and the careers and all. Straight away, I had a bunch of questions between, but I just want to sort of ask a different question over here. Is about from these conversations, what are takeaways that you think want the Bloom team to apply, or you would want to apply to Bloom as an organization as we grow, as we evolve into a larger company, or or a larger portfolio, so to say. So not for our founders, but for us.
No, I think too many. I keep insisting, as you can see on our internal groups, that I want everyone to listen to every episode. I couldn't have arranged or come up with orchestrated a better set of educational classes, right?
Hmm.
And it's difficult, right? It's not like we make eyewear or we do chemicals, but on the other hand, we are a financial services company, and there were three financial services companies in here, right? And so there's a lot to take away from how financial services companies are built, more than any other sector, I would argue. Why? Because it has everything to do with being custodians of somebody's money,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so definitely double click on what it means to Ramdeo and a Nitin and a Radhika on what it takes to build. One is actually an asset management house like us, and the other two are more like tech. So if you see, the compounding journey start much later, after
Hmm.
people trust you with their money and you've shown returns, right?
Right.
And so financial services businesses take even longer, because not a instant gratification of buying a consumer product, wearing it, being happy with it, right? It's like, hey, I gave you my hard-earned money, like everything I've earned and kept aside, I'm giving it to you to be a custodian. And that's what I need people to understand, that as fun as venture capital sounds like, and as formulaic as an Excel sheet might show on portfolio construction, every rupee that you lose should hurt you, right? It's a part of the business, I get that, but I think that not too many youngsters in venture capital get it. So my team should definitely understand why this is such a long term game and why this takes 30 to 40 years. Coincidentally, between the last episode recording and our current today's recording, I also heard Lisa Clarkson, Elizabeth Clarkson's podcast on 20VC around venture capital funds. And she says, every time you sign up, and which is what I've been trying to tell people, I put your mug on the pitch deck. Essentially, I expect the same thing that the LPs expect, which is 12 to 15 years of loyalty to the money that you raised on the virtue of your mug also being on the pitch deck. To push that responsibility onto Karthik, Sanjay, Ashish, Arpit, Sajid is like unfair in my view. So, as you can see, all this has been playing on my head. It's always, obviously, this theme didn't come today, right? It came 1 year ago when we tried to design the T-shirt for this year's Bloom, which meant that it's been playing on my head for a while. All of this messaging is only validation has come from the podcast. My storytell has been consistent across the firm, across the year. And as you know, internally, we have done a lot of work to even do internal podcasts around this topic and what it means to be a Blumiere inside the team, and why 30, 40 year journeys are important. So I think the podcast helped in reinforcing this at one level, our business, right? The second most important thing, and this is where I'm hoping the youngsters get the benefit of what I didn't get 10, 12 years ago when I started Bloom, is why bother picking founders, or for that matter, picking team members who don't believe in power of compounding and long term journey?
Makes sense. Yeah.
It's a criminal waste. It's a criminal waste of time. more than anything else. Forget about the money for a second. Why would you want to spend time with such people, right? What is the thrill of like taking an asset and flipping it over in 6 months, 12 months, 15 months? That's a stock market play. You can take a punt on a stock for that. You don't have to come and like do early stage investing for that, right? So I think it's super tough to sell the mission of a venture capital firm and what it means. And Beezer Clarkson podcast with Harry Stebbings is useful. It reiterates everything that we've known internally, but maybe I've not been able to communicate strongly enough to the world. That some 50% drop off between first time managers and second time managers. Same firm, meaning same fund. They don't even raise. 70%, 75% by the time it gets to fund four.
Amazing. Yeah.
So you should question what the hell are you doing in a VC firm and why are you building, right? And so I don't think that's well understood. And I'll therefore come to what are we doing in venture capital and why should you be doing this as well?
No, I think it's fascinating. Some of these stats, I think, and of course, these are not well understood. I think not outside venture, but also, as you're saying, also within venture in that sense, right? One of the points, Karthik, you touched upon this, the longevity with the firm. I think it's an interesting point. Just want to double click on it. Also, in context to something that Manish Sabharwal said, in one of his responses. Obviously, the episode was basically him doing quotable quotes through and through. But there's one thing which stayed with me, which he said, that he went to a college and he offered kids two choices. You take 10 lakh now versus you take 1 paisa now, which doubles every day. The 10 lakh remains there. And he said, while people chose 10 lakh, majority of them, they should have picked like 1 paisa, which doubles every day because it will become much bigger at the end of 31st day. To which his wife quipped that, hey, till 24th day, if you take 10 lakh, you are better off. Because that's when the 1 paisa doubling will actually move beyond threshold. And that's the sort of the compounding, which is sort of now kicking in. So I think one, and I've since then has stayed with me, and I've been wondering that at what point do you know that the compounding is either about to kick in, or you want it to kick in, or you start thinking about it. And in the same light, you mentioned about it, there was a penny drop moment for you. So if you can also talk about that, what was the penny drop moment 4 years ago? Was there a second penny drop moment about when you think, okay, compounding has to start? I think these are two interlinked questions in my mind.
So I'll finish the penny drop one, which is easier. Basically, the penny drop one is that when you start returning capital, people will happily give it back. So if you don't stick around till the 15th year or so and actually start showing capital back in spades, you really can't enjoy the fruits of that 15 years of labor. It actually kicks in only in the 15th year. And therefore, you have to build a firm that sustains itself smoothly, and there is a career progression for others after you. Ironically, you've done all the hard work, but they can benefit from it. But hopefully, the pot then increases to make it worthwhile for everybody. $20 million fund, $290 million fund. How much ever you compound money, there's only finite amount of dollars you can make. You can't make a 50 bagger on the $20 million fund versus a 5 bagger on the $290 million. So the rewards are going to compound only after the 15th year was becoming very clear. Then you can't build a firm which is short term in its nature and put your pitch deck out there when you know that every time you put your pitch deck, it's another 12, 15 years. So that was the penny drop moment for me. I think you're absolutely right in the Manish Sabharwal analogy applies a lot more to a very circumstantial fund like Blume, which was we had no experience before this. So no one was willing to give us any credit for having worked in venture capital or having shown a track record. So no one gave us institutional money. No one told us to raise 20, right? We knew from market circumstances that all we could do was 20. There are firms which rode on their prior track record, came up in 2016 to 18, and raised three-digit million-dollar funds off the bat. So they had no obligations from the past because they were not the partners who raised that fund or had that obligation, but took all the good part of that, came and got like instantaneous step function compound. So actually the question you ask is the trick is that he was trying to teach a lesson to school kids around the actual math around compound. Venture capital is the art of actually gaming that 1 paisa a day. In step functions, you're supposed to pick up 10 paisa, 20 paisa also.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right? And so that doubling finding what unit can double to accelerate the time factor is the genius of the founder and the VC, if you ask me.
Right, right.
Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. It'll fail most of the time, which is why we have 60% loss ratios, right? But look at the problems picked. The problems picked are those that can compound beyond the 1 paisa doubling. The same thing, you pick up 10 paisa on the first. Still, half the class will take the 10 lakhs on day one and walk away. But I haven't done the math, but you put it into Calci right now. I'm sure that 24 days shrinks to like 10 or 12 or something of that nature. Now tell me it's not worthwhile to build.
Hmm.
Because from the 12 to 30, now that compounding effect is like going to whip the 10 lakhs by any means. 10 lakhs at best can be given to a wealth manager earning 12%.
Interesting.
So that's capped. You can only earn 12% on that, right? Or 13%. But this 10 paisa is compounding at like some crazy orthogonal rate, which has everything to do with what I call step function compounding, not linear compounding. So you take a giant step on day one, and then in between you take 2-3 giant steps, you can compound like crazy. So COVID was a step function compounding factor for a lot of businesses. New technology which like allows you to put up, like pixel putting spectral imaging satellites at super cheap prices because prices have gotten knocked down from where they were 10 years ago, is a massive startup, zero to like not 10 paisa in that example, but more like 2 rupees almost.
Yeah.
Compounding factor. So, so the speed at which you can compound then just changes dramatically. And I think that's the trick. So sometimes if you notice now in Blume, we wait for 3-4 years to see whether this is a linear or it's already the step functions have been achieved and jump in little late. Or we pick like really edgy tech, which because of circumstances has that step function advantage on day one. That's my counter to Manish's more rigid mathematical principle of 1 paisa a day.
Basically, step function compounding and not just simple linear compounding. Amazing. Yeah. Karthik, towards sort of one of the last few questions on this, I think one is on. I think you have personally pushed these episodes out to a lot of founders, like almost everyone in the portfolio, a lot of people outside portfolio. We've had some great feedback from founders. In fact, I remember when we were having Bloom Bash in the morning, bunch of founders wrote to you saying, "Hey, this is a great episode." And I probably asked you, I think they're worried that they want to quiz you, ki ye suna hai ki nahi episode, and that is why they suddenly all of them are just sort of listening to this podcast and sending you feedback. But yeah, I mean, if you think of it, you touched upon the threads and the common themes. If there was one big piece of advice, and I think there are many, so I think I think I'm putting probably a unfair burden on you. But because there are many themes and many great pieces of advice, but if there was maybe one or maybe two in that zone piece of advice for the founders that you would, aspiring founders that you want to share with them, you touched about them earlier, so I think now is the right time to unpack them.
I think fundamentally what every great entrepreneur will say, which is basically build for your customers who you really care about, right? So I think if you think about entrepreneurship, at least in the venture funded avatar, as something that can make you money, it's either scheming or in a good way, using the word in a good way, or it's like trading for that. Is it an enterprise that can be built and can compound? I don't think so. So only things that can compound, and we touched upon it with a lot of founders, right? Around what it means for brand to compound, customer love to compound, culture to compound. And so essentially, I think when you build for customers and the problem that you care about a lot, then all of this flows more naturally, number one. And then you're building to leave a legacy, not some valuation or some exit, right? Which is a venture capital problem. It should be a founder problem. The takeaway is, guys, if you build something that gets forgotten even before the decade marker is done, then truly was that a journey worth building for? Of course, they could have made money. I'm not saying, see, money is a side effect, right? So if you ask me, what lesson are you giving the founders? This would be it, right? And then when you build leaving that legacy, I think you make every stakeholder that was a part of it very proud of the journey. Like, I worked in American Express in my first job, and there was this pride of what that card meant in my wallet even 20 years later.
Right, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Right. And so can more brands do that? Indigo is so mechanical in the way it treats me as a customer that at some level I despise it. But to the rest of the world, I laud it as one of the best operational excellence businesses built globally, most operationally challenging and cost challenging businesses in the world, right? And I will to death say that one of the most beautifully executed businesses ever in the history of mankind, I think, right? So, I think you'll create that sense of pride in what you build when you obsess with the customer problem and solve for it. Everything else takes care of itself. So that's my primary take.
Got it. Got it. It sort of takes me back to, some, I think one of the other things you said the other day was about, as a founder, do you want to be a chapter in the book of entrepreneurship India, or do you want to be a footnote, right? So I think obviously being a chapter is I think in a way is what you are saying. Great. Karthik, I think I've all the questions I've run through, but if there is anything else that you would want to add and you want the listeners to sort of think about, please share. Yeah.
Pre-shoot, when we discussed it, I think you said also one last. I know you asked it in two different ways. One I've answered. You said what would be a key takeaway or piece of advice on power of compounding for the Blume team to apply in their lives, as much like the founder. So I think the final word on the founder, for example, is, which I've said a fair bit this year. Not that I didn't know it before, but I think everybody in the team has been repeating it, that all of these stories are so unique. I think the 9 stories we presented this year and the 8 we presented last year, yes, there are common learnings which are more sort of emotional gut, but the stories are so unique. Why? They're built for different customers, they're built by different personas, they're built in a different point of time, right? So the story is yours to make, is unique. So don't copy paste, cut paste from others, right? Is my take. Now I'm using that as a segue because from a venture capitalist standpoint, also that matters a lot.
Right. Right. Right.
So we tend to get sucked up into pattern matching so much that we don't understand that's not going to make the real, you know, uh, publishing worthy story. But it's the fact that somebody built an exception to that formula is that's going to create that story, right? So basically, one of my first year annual quarterly reports that I wrote to my investors, I used to write these quotes on top. So there was, I think, a Martin Luther King. There was maybe a Buffett. I don't know. There was a Bezos, and there was, of course, our good friend and mentor Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Right? And so, idealistic as I was back in the day, basically, I said we want to fund the change we want to see. So, adapting from
Super.
we should be the change we want to
Super.
see.
Yeah.
Right? The one thing also that I wanted to add for the founders is that they should learn every story is unique, right? So don't ever fall into the trap of blindly imitating, one of our guests in the podcast series, right? So that said, you will find there is a subtle element of what one particular founder does that appeals to you because it's your personality also, your belief also, your vision also. And so that's what I think I've gotten on my feedback on the WhatsApp chats after people listen. They say I related to this, I love this aspect, and it's very clear that that particular founder, that's all they'll take away from that. So it's great. Take takeaways, but your stories are going to be unique because the point in time which you started the company, the macro variables around you, the customer has changed and evolved. So you can't cut paste anything. And so I wanted to use that as a segue to say that that applies the way Blume team members also see the world. Right? Please don't fall into this trap of pattern matching to the extent that you're looking for a China copycat or an India copycat or X of Y, Y of X. It's easy to say, but it's a trap in my view because eventually what will get built and become legendary is not a copy. It will be something unique, right? So your job is to judge that. So that's what I would exhort most, of our colleagues and the venture capital industry to focus on.
Thank you so much, Karthik. This is a wrap. Thanks for being a great host for the second season of the Blume Podcast. For our listeners who are here for the first time, you can listen to the Blume Podcast on Spotify, YouTube, and in your favorite podcast app. Please do let us know your feedback wherever you're listening. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Rohit, for setting everything up, and a lovely team that we've had both across all 3, 4 cities that have allowed us to seamlessly execute this season. It's been a pleasure.